So the INTP and ISTP value similar perceiving functions, but their judging functions are quite different. This has quite a range of implications on their outlook on the world. From an outside perspective, both of these types seem to be clearly introverted and focus on T function judging criterion. Their introversion has a tendency to hide their emotions and dampen the overall effect that their extroverted counterparts give off. In that regard, I'm talking about like the ISTP and the INTP. For this video, I'll be going over a couple different levels of analysis. The letter dichotomies, polar functions, valued functions, the positive and negative functions that are part of my system. Valued functions are also part of my system. Shared and non-shared dichotomies. So starting on with the attributes based off the letter dichotomies, both types are introverted, leading with their judging T function. This means that they prefer to analyze systems and processes over people and social dynamics. The obvious difference between the two types is the SN dichotomy. The ISTP has a preference for the concrete. They assess the physical world and use their analysis of said world as a tool to augment their T function. MBTI doesn't distinguish between the functions based on quadras, and thus analysis using MBTI functions would say that the ISTP uses conditional logic, TI, as their main function. When using the function dynamics of model B in conjunction with the definitions, definitions of model I, we can see that the ISTP's TI has a different focus than that of the INTP. Over here on the right hand side, we have a rather busy infograph that labels each of the functions based off of block. These blocks, each of these shapes means something specific. I'm not going to go into detail. The important thing to note here is that if you look at this is socionic, so the J and P are flipped. If you look at the top left block, this is going to be their most dominant block. For the INTJ, their most dominant block is their T functions. They lead with a negative TI that's paired up with positive TE. And on that, they have positive NE that's paired up with negative NI. So INTP, positive NE, negative NI, negative TI, positive TE. All of the alpha quadras perceiving functions are positive, they're superficial, and all of their judging functions are negative or not so superficial. Whereas with the beta quadra and the ISTP, all of their perceiving functions are negative, and all of their judging functions are positive or superficial. That don't necessarily mean that they have different types of each of the functions. So they both have TI, right? But their TI is going to be a different form. Alright, moving on. These functions are paired up with their counterparts. The function that they use, the negative or positive function, they're paired up with the opposite function effectively. So negative TI is paired up with positive TE always. That way overall this function stays the same in every type, uses every single function aspect. Yeah, so this keeps up with the logical consistency of the system. An INTP has dominant or main. Just keep in mind, I think a better usage of the term dominant would be your first two functions, because those are the most dominant functions you use when interacting with the world. So I would be inclined to call this your main function or something like that, but I'm pulling these from a couple different sources online. So your dominant slash main function, the INTP is negative TI, positive TE, whereas the ISTP is positive TI, negative TE. The tool function, positive NE, negative NI, negative SE, positive SI, negative FE, positive FI, positive FE, negative FI. These are flipped around, obviously. Opposing role, ignoring these functions are going to be fairly similar. The main difference is that the signs are all going to be reversed, and then the function that's either the demonstrative function or the polar function, and so on and so forth, those are going to be changed a little bit. But for the most part, for a couple of the functions rather, they're going to look fairly similar. The combined positive and negative functions are laid out to show which one is the primary goal and which one is subservient to that goal. In this regard, the positive and negative functions have some symmetry in respect to the dominant creative function dynamic. If we define these functions, we can begin to see the difference of these two types. So positive TI I define as analyze, organize, and create structure. This pairs up with negative TE, which is here, assessment, prioritization, and implementation of efficiency. That is the reason why the INTJ, also specifically the ENTJ, which is more apparent what they do. They seem to prefer structure, organization, and efficiency. And they use that efficiency for the ENTJ, they use it as their main goal to mess around with the world. So positive TI is analyze, organize, and create structure. Negative TI is break down incoming data into a logical structure beneath. So structure. Positive TE is accumulation of storage of factual information. So just taking the basic information as it is. Negative TE is assessment, prioritization, and implementation of efficiency. This negative TE will encompass, to some regard, this positive TE. Just like this negative TI will encompass, to some regard, this positive TI. There is structure to the logical structure, as so to speak. So the ISTP uses efficiency to create organization and structure as a means to organize incoming information. The INTP breaks down factual information to determine the logical structure of the system that information adheres to. So these are the main judging function between the two, falls under these four. For the F functions, positive FI is how did incoming information make me feel? Negative FI is how could incoming information make myself and others feel? So a little bit of a deeper analysis in relation to yourself and to others, whereas this is in relation to yourself. Positive FE is what is the emotional atmosphere and can I handle it? Negative FE is what would be the best way of handling the emotional atmosphere? So positive is a little bit more of a superficial analysis, and it's looking at the emotional atmosphere. Same with the negative FE, but it's more superficial. It's more in regards to self. Whereas negative FE is in regards to self and others, handling the emotional atmosphere of the group. And it's more of a deeper analysis. These definitions are functional in nature and do not address the underlying concept at work here. That level of analysis is not pertinent to this topic and would take far too long. As far as the ISTP and INTP go, though, when dealing with information relating to social dynamics or people, the ISTP will assess how the incoming information may make themselves and others feel, and use that analysis as a barometer for the emotional atmosphere. The INTP will assess how the incoming information made them feel, and use that analysis to determine the best way of handling the emotional atmosphere. So really, it's how they implement these F functions is what's going on here. These overlapping function identities calls back to the overall function being the interest in people and social dynamics, as well as explain why every type will be empathic. This is something that's a kind of a misnomer with FI and MBTI, is that the FIs are the empathic ones. Technically, that's true because FI is how it makes other people feel and how it makes you feel. But both FI and FE deal with this because the function overall deals with emotions and social dynamics in people. The ISTP and INTP are probably very poor. I say probably because as the individual they're probably. As groups in general, they are very poor at using these functions, especially when they're young. This poor function usage obfuscates the attentional manner of the type respectively. So this whole notion of like whether or not they're analyzing and trying to assess how they should determine or like how it makes them feel, blah, like all this stuff gets lost once you start to like watch the INTP and ISTP, because they both more or less will look like they're doing the exact same thing. It's when you get down to the actual processes happening at the bottom that you kind of figure out that, oh, okay, there's something inherently different or fundamentally different about their approach. Intuition function definitions. Positive NE is generation of possibilities, from the singular to the many. So you take one thing, say you have like a red balloon, and from that red balloon, ideas will start generating possibilities, will just keep springing forth. Negative NE is the elimination of possibilities from the many to the few. So negative NE tends to have just infinite possibilities or tons of possibilities in their head, and they just are pulling from them. These functions will work in tandem with their NI counterparts. Positive NI is visualize the essence or integral nature of something. Negative NI is interpreting possible connections. So the ISTP and INTP both value positive NE and negative NI. ISTPs generate possibilities to interpret possible connections. INTPs interpret possible connections to generate possibilities. So let's go back up here real quick and look at the functions. And you can see here the ISTP's seeking inferior function is negative NI that's augmented by positive NE. And the INTP's tool function is positive NE augmented by negative NI. Alright, so going back down. INTPs interpret possible connections to generate possibilities. These functions are incredibly similar, and for all intents and purposes are virtually the same thing. The difference between the two types is that INTPs are N-dominant types, whereas ISTPs are S-dominant types. This means that the INTP will have stronger function usage over the entire aspect of intuition, and ISTPs will have stronger function usage over the entire aspect of sensing. This strength shows up in the demonstrative function, which is positive NI, negative NE for INTP, and let me pull up. The demonstrative function for the ISTP is the positive SE, negative SI. Positive NI paired with negative NE can be described as eliminating possibilities to visualize the integral nature of something. This function is the polar of ISTP, not INTP. Is the polar of ISTP. We'll talk about polar functions here in a little bit. Sensing function definitions. Positive SE. Interact with the physical universe, creating shifts and hierarchies that can be used. Now, here's the first time I mentioned hierarchies really again in this video. And for hierarchies, I want to make it clear that hierarchies are constructed objects. They don't actually exist. People or things that have theory of mind or agency tend to analyze systems and put things in ranking order, and that ranking order in any capacity is the hierarchies. So at the same time, there are no hierarchies. Hierarchies don't exist, yet there are also infinite hierarchies, and each individual and each person doing that analysis will generate their own list of hierarchies and can constantly do that. That's one of the things that needs to be really noted here, especially when it comes to SE. So positive SE is interact with the physical universe, creating shifts and hierarchies that can be used. Negative SE is analyze the natural dynamics of hierarchies and utilize shifts in said hierarchies to attain goals. So as you can see here, positive is a little more shallow of an analysis, and they're talking about positive is themselves acting upon the world to create shifts and hierarchies. A friend of mine used the word chaos, like introducing chaos to a system in order to do whatever they want, in order to solve conflict, actually, which is an interesting definition in and of itself. Whereas negative SE is more of an analysis of all the dynamics, ones that are started by the user and started by others, and they will utilize the shifts, any shifts in the hierarchies, including shifts that they make their own. Positive SI is attain appropriate control of hierarchy to ensure comfort. So negative SI is analyze physicalities pertinent to ascending the hierarchy. This is the same thing. Positive is rather shallow. Negative is a little more analytical. So positive is just looking to reach a state of comfort. There's not much going past this function and saying, what do I need to do to make sure that I live a life that I deem is where I'm happy. Negative SI analyzes comfort and discomfort and everything else, and then uses that information to assess or interact with a hierarchy. They use it in conjunction with this. The ISTP and INTP both value negative SE and positive SI. ISTPs implement control over the physical world as a foundation from which they can utilize shifts in the hierarchy to attain their goals. INTPs utilize shifts in hierarchies to achieve desired comfort level. So those sound wildly different, and they are for the most part. They kind of are. So a lot of times the ISTP's goals are comfort, so keep that in mind. So going with that basis, these functions are also going to be incredibly similar, and the disparity between function strength will be the key difference in function usage. So that is to say that the sensing user is going to be a lot better at using all of these things. As a sensing dominant type, the ISTP is going to be strong at using all aspects of the sensing function, including positive SE and negative SI, which is their demonstrative function. The INTP is going to have positive SE and negative SI as a polar function. This means that one of the most discernible differences, I use this word again, one of the most discernible differences between the two types is that they have the other's polar function as their demonstrative. Alright, to assess the polar function, we need to define it and detail what aspects of it the user will be neglecting. Let's start with positive SE and negative SI. We can define that as the ability to assess physicalities to determine importance for creating shifts in hierarchies that they can use. So positive SE is using shifts in the hierarchy because it's positive, it's shallow. The negative SI is assessing the physicalities. Because it's negative, it's a little more deep. It's no longer about assessing comfort as positive SI would be. As an overall aspect of the function, the INTP will be fairly poor at analyzing the physical world. This could imply that they don't perceive sensory data as well as others, but more specifically, they don't perceive power dynamics and hierarchies as well as others. SE is the function that is responsible for taking action. An SE user actively tries to engage in hierarchies, whether taking advantage of naturally occurring shifts in the hierarchy or creating a shift in the hierarchy. To extrapolate, INTPs are extremely poor at engaging in hierarchies and will actively avoid being the cause of shifts in said hierarchies. So while it is definitely possible and actually probable for an INTP to reach some measure of success, their polar function leads to this being incredibly hard for them. And they will almost always find their success at the behest of others. So an INTP will not feel or will not really be able to go out and just do something on their own. They will not be able to cause some sort of chaos. They won't want to, and they'll hate the notion of introducing chaos to a system. And with that being said, because their S functions are so weak, they're going to be reticent to actually take advantage of shifts in the hierarchy, but they eventually will. The one thing about INTP is their most dominant function, TI, is conditional logic. Negative TI is conditional logic. And it's one of the things that society has really put on a pedestal. The IQ test is an example of this. So it is probable over an entire lifetime an INTP will reach some measure of success. But they are definitely the type that will sit in their mom's basement doing nothing for years until they're finally kicked out and have to go live on their own, and then someone will fucking help them and they'll reach their success. Or their mom will continue to help them, and this measure of success that they reach will be at the behest of their mother. Okay. Similarly, as an overall aspect of intuition, the ISTP will be fairly poor at assessing abstract concepts and any form of ideation that isn't tied to the physical, practical world. NI is the function that is responsible for deciphering patterns. An NI user will naturally be able to identify archetypes, corollaries, and other tangentially related patterns. ISTP will have difficulty doing this process. Their ability to use this function will be based on how often they pulled themselves away from their S functions and use some aspect of abstraction. These of which S functions will interface with the world leads them to having a higher degree of success, especially before the modern era. This is the reason why current humans are considered more intelligent on average compared to their counterparts in history. IQ tests heavily lean on abstract concepts. So an ISTP, which has positive NI with negative NE as a polar function, will actively avoid the function. So going over this a little bit further, the ISTP will innately find success in using the REST functions, which they are going to be strong at, in interfacing with the world. And without a given reason, they probably wouldn't lean on abstraction that much at all. And part of that is they'll be weak at all the n functions, but they'll be notably weak at the ni functions and positive ni, because it's just a function that they would never really want to use. They would have no real reason to do so. That being said, education system typically tends to go along this little axiom of abstractness. The education system in mathematics and a bunch of other things talk about abstract concepts quite a bit. So the ISTP, it's not like they would be any less intelligent than... that's not what I mean to say here with this IQ test or referencing this. The ISTP is very smart individual. In fact, they're going to be great at things like math, because math is just systems and constructs, and they have a focus on the T function, which is systems and concepts like that. Anyways, the point is that an ISTP can be very, very weak at their n function. In fact, the n function can be the weakest function out of all the functions for S types, for S DOMs, because they don't, in many ways, they don't need to use their n functions. This is countervalued in society because by a lot of people really value that intuition and really value insight, which is an aspect of abstraction or n functions. Going on. Positive NI and negative NE can be defined as eliminating possibilities to visualize the essence or integral nature of something. The INTP has this function as their demonstrative functions. This means that you will see them doing this process constantly. So, eliminating possibilities to visualize the essence or integral nature of something. This is rather negationary in its aspect, because it's eliminating things. But the key thing to pull in here is this is how someone is able to guess the end of a movie or guess the plot twist in a thing and stuff like that, because they're able to see these patterns. I think of positive NI as being more archetypal type of thought processes. Okay, for the dichotomies. So this is the end of the analysis of positive and negative function and the letter dichotomies, which we'll get further into a little bit below. We've talked about the polar functions and how they work, and we've talked about valued functions to some extent. We'll be talking more about valued functions in relation to the dichotomies, but for the most part, we're done with the positive and negative functions. We're done with the first aspect of the letter dichotomy. We should be done more or less with polar functions, and we're halfway through on the valued functions. We can break down the dichotomies into 4 different groups: letter dichotomies, quadradichotomies, the dual/conflicting dichotomies, and the remaining 5. For the purpose of this analysis, I'll be assessing the letter and quadradichotomies as a whole, and then analyzing the rest of their shared dichotomies and then not shared. So let's start with the letter dichotomies. These 2 types share 3 letter dichotomies, which means that in a general sense they will act similarly because they are both introverts, their dominant function is a judging function, and they have more of an interest in things rather than people. So this is a fairly basic analysis, but if you were to, say you're trying to set up your canvas to paint on, these things might indicate like the hue of your background and all the things like that, like the large brushstrokes that the average person or the average level of analysis will be able to see quite clearly. Like, hey, that person's an introvert. Hey, that person leads with a judging function, although this might take a little time because they're introverts. And hey, they seem to have more of an interest in things, they're rather poor at dealing with social dynamics. Okay, so quadradichotomies. Quadradichotomies. Each quadra only shares one dichotomy with another quadra. For the ISTP and INTP, they share the Mary-Series dichotomy. This means that they differ on the democratic-aristocratic dichotomy, as well as the judicious/decisive dichotomy. So we'll get into those here in a little bit. For the ISTP, this means that this type is in a natural, ready state. They don't like to waste time discussing something once they know what to do, and in general, they consider the rewards for the work more important than the working conditions. They tend to identify people based on the group that they are associated with and will use expressions that are specific to a group. Conversely, the INTP is in a natural, relaxed state. They like to focus on preparation, and action is considered less important. They're only active during the times they need to be honest. They will consider working conditions more than they will compensation. They tend to identify people based on personal qualities, such as things like interesting, pleasant, good looking, and so on and so forth. They don't typically identify people based on groups, nor will they use expressions that are group specific. So they're not likely to have weird individual phrases for their groups. They're more likely to be the types that are like, "Hey, everyone knows this meme." Anyways, both of them are on the merry side of the merry-serious dichotomy. This means that they are good at noticing the emotional background of an activity and perceive any emotional aspect of group interaction to be separate from the activity. A good example of this is if you go bowling, and for some reason the bowling alley keeps on messing, your individual alley keeps messing up and knocking over the pins, and it just kind of turns into a disaster. The game falls apart. The serious side of the dichotomy will let that really seriously negatively affect them, and they will consider the activity or the group interaction as a whole to not be fun, whereas the merry side will consider the group interaction as the thing that is fun, and the activity as the thing that it's just almost like a call to action. Okay, continuing on. They are not inclined to believe in an objective truth. Truth is relative. They tend to say things like, "Look at it this way." They are inclined to propose another conception of the situation. When something is done wrong, they will ask why it was done that way, wanting to have both parties understand the concepts that are being spoken of. Okay. Shared dichotomies. These types tend to verbalize things from a static standpoint. If you ask them to tell you what they did on a date, they would give you a step-by-step breakdown of the events. But if you asked them while they were doing stuff, they would consider their actions and plans more fluid or dynamic. They are more inclined to describe stage A, stage B, and stage C, rather than describing how stage A leads to stage B, which leads to stage C. They tend to treat their ideas as sacred, but are fairly open with their resources. They tend to have a mentality of "I won't abandon my interests just because my resources are inadequate, but simply work towards improving my resources until they are adequate." Lastly, they tend to concentrate on the emotional background of the interaction, with business as a secondary concern. They prefer new and unknown rather than familiar emotional anchors. For the most part, information perceived as unprofessional or low quality can leave them indifferent. So, both types will behave this way. This is something that both types share. For the non-shared dichotomies, and this getting into how you can tell them apart a little more, INTPs are focused on goals and manipulate them with their methods unsettled. They prefer to defend said goals and don't like to be forced to deviate from them. ISTPs tend to focus on methods and manipulate them with their goals unsettled. They prefer to expand options and don't like to have too few of them. ISTPs tend to be positivists. This means that they tend to be socially and intellectually more trusting. They tend to explain how things should be, whereas INTPs tend to be negativists. This means that they are more mistrusting and are negationary in manner. They explain how things should not be. INTPs tend to be results-oriented. This means that they focus on the beginning and the end of the processes, but are detached from the processes themselves and tend to multitask. They are more inclined to read text randomly, such as reading random paragraphs or chapters. ISTPs tend to be process-oriented. This means that they do things sequentially from beginning to end. They immerse themselves in the process and tend to single task. ISTPs may have the mindset, "Of course the answer's right, since we followed the correct procedure." Conversely, the INTPs may have the mindset of course we followed the correct procedure, since we got the right answer." Lastly, the INTPs tend to dialogue. They tend to affirm the receipt of information, have a tendency to interrupt, and feel comfortable pausing halfway through their speech. They have a questions aloud all the time policy. They will often ask non-rhetorical questions and answer said questions themselves. Will occasionally start talking at times, expecting someone to get interested and start paying attention. The ISTPs tend to monologue. So real quick, I'll go over this real quick. This will occasionally start talking at times, expecting someone to get interested and start paying attention. Because INTPs are so introverted, they're probably the most introverted types. They're less inclined to do this than a lot of the other types that share this dichotomy. In fact, they're probably on the farthest end of this, or one of the farthest ends of this dichotomy. Maybe not the farthest, because they are interested in ideation and sharing their positions with other people. But in general, this is a fairly rare occurrence, but it will happen. You will have some INTP that looks at someone else and says, "Oh, this person might be interested in this thing," or so on and so forth. And from that, they come to the conclusion that they'll just, start saying stuff, and the person responds, and so be it. If the person doesn't respond, then they'll shut up fairly quickly, or they'll go and do something else. Moving on. The ISTPs tend to monologue. They tend to listen attentively and silently, and will wait for the other person to be done speaking before starting on their own. They prefer to finish their speech before letting others talk. They like closure and knowing that their point was accurately conveyed. Their questions are often rhetorical or only strictly motivated by a need for specific information. So as the final analysis of this entire situation, both the IXTPs are aware of the emotional background present in a group interaction and tend to adhere to that rather than the activity or business that's presented, or so on and so forth. They both tend to keep their ideas sacred. They're not necessarily interested in sharing their ideas with others. They don't believe in an objective truth. INTPs are negationary in general, but are proponents of open dialogue, whereas ISTPs tend to be a little more constructive, but they prefer their interactions to be a little more turn-based. Such as I tell you X information, you tell me Y information. Both of them are introverted, and both are poor at dealing with people and social dynamics. ISTPs tend to be concrete in nature, whereas INTPs tend to be abstract. This is the overall analysis of them. We have 6 pages here, and there's a lot of things to pull from. This conclusion here is fairly short, and it doesn't encompass all of it, nor do I think it should. There's just too much here. So going back over, we've gone over the letter dichotomies now completely between these and down below. We've gone over the polar function and how they both have each other's polar function as their own demonstrative function, and how that'll make them significantly different. We've gone over valued functions to some extent. The valued functions lead to the dichotomies. That's where you get these dichotomies from, specifically the quadridichotomies. The positive and negative function. We've introduced this top concept. I'm not going to completely explain this because it's just too much. And then lastly, the shared and non-shared dichotomies, and that goes back into what I was talking about, the valued functions. So, yeah, I hope based off of this information you can kind of pull out what the key difference is. I think one key difference that I haven't really seen noted here, or haven't been able to note here rather, is that INTPs tend to constantly be fucking with you, whereas ISTPs tend to be a little more serious constantly. It's interesting how that is conveyed through the dichotomies and their interaction styles, but yeah, I'll have to work on explaining that further going forward. Okay, that about wraps it up. We have discussed the ISTP and the INTP quite a bit, gone over the differences between them, their similarities, what people are seeing, what the underlying values are, and extrapolated quite a bit from that. We've gone over some positive and negative function aspects and polar function aspects and so on and so forth. I think this has been a fairly adequate analysis of the two types in relation to each other, and this should give you more insights and to be able to determine whether or not someone is an S-type or an N-type, or if you're specifically looking between ISTP and INTP, whether or not someone's one of those two types. If you like this video, please hit the like and subscribe button. If you have any comments or ideas or analysis, critiques, so on and so forth, if you want to talk, please post down below. I'm looking to actively engage with the community. I hope you have a good day. Thank you so much.